environmental action and corporate environmental reporting. My name is Fred. I'm from an environmental organization called CDP, which focuses on corporate environmental reporting. I am based in our Hong Kong office, where we work with mainly large listed companies throughout Southeast Asia, and I will help facilitate this webinar and this workshop today. This workshop is the first in a series of workshops that we will be rolling out throughout 2021 in partnership with GRI, or the Global Reporting Initiative. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping rules. Please note that all participants are muted on entry to avoid background noise. If you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A box. So at the bottom of your screen, you can see a Q&A chat function, and we will do our best to answer all of the questions throughout the event. And we will have multiple Q&A sessions today to answer your questions. And lastly, please also note that this webinar is recorded, and we will share a link to the recording and to the slide deck after the event. And the slide deck will also be available in Thai after the event. Before we start, I would like to briefly share some more information and context as to why we are here today. This capacity building program is made possible by the UK government through funding from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And the program is called UK Pact Green Recovery Fund, where PACT stands for Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transitions. This program is part of the UK's commitment to tackle climate change, and they work with partner countries and organizations to accelerate clean growth transitions and pursue greater climate action. Together with GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, we at CDP applied to be part of this program to deliver capacity building for listed companies in Thailand on corporate ESG issues, or environmental, social, and governance issues. From CDP side, we will focus on global best practice when it comes to corporate environmental action and reporting in the context of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD for short. Our partners at GRI will be focusing on how you can align your business goals and KPIs with the Sustainable Development Goals. We will do this training through a series of workshops throughout 2021. Today and tomorrow are the first workshops in this series. And in the first round, we will focus on introducing these concepts that I just mentioned, TCFD and the Sustainable Development Goals. Then in the later workshops, we will go more in depth on specific topics such as climate-related scenario analysis and climate risk assessments. In addition to these workshops, we are also planning to publish some reports in Thai language to supplement this training. These will be available later, and we will keep you posted on the development. So we already also have a number of useful resources and are aiming to translate them to make it available to a wider audience. So let's get started with today's workshop, which is to introduce the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, also known as the TCFD. Today's learning outcomes, we have a few intended outcomes. First, it is to become familiar with the background and the purpose and the structure of the TCFD. And then we will go into what the guidelines and the recommendations are. And then also after that, we will show you how CDP can help you to build your own roadmap towards alignment and with the TCFD recommended disclosures. And finally, we will also share information about the resources that we have available to help you preparing a TCFD report. So again, Thank you very much to everyone who have joined us today. And also a big thanks to the UK Pact Green Recovery Fund and the British Embassy in Bangkok for making this capacity building program possible. And also a big thanks to our partners at the Stock Exchange of Thailand, who is providing invaluable support in developing and rolling out this project. Here is the agenda for today. As you can see, we have quite a lot to cover. We are pleased to be joined by the Stock Exchange of Thailand and the British Embassy in Bangkok for opening remarks. After that, CDP's regional director will give a macro level insight into the current state of play in corporate environmental trends. Next, my colleague Joe will break down the TCFD recommendations and what they are. And this will be followed by a presentation on how you can use CDP's questionnaire as a tool to help your organization develop their own roadmap for TCFD aligned reporting. And then finally, my colleague Elim will share more information about what resources are available to support your efforts. So without further ado, to deliver the opening remarks, I am pleased to introduce Kun Ratwali Anantanonont, Senior Vice President and Head of Sustainable Development Department 1 at the Stock Exchange of Thailand. So Kun Ratwali, over to you, please.
สวัสดีค่ะท่านผู้เข้าร่วมอบรมทุกท่านนะคะก่อนอื่นต้องขอบคุณที่ทุกท่านให้ความสนใจในการเข้าร่วมอบรมในวันนี้นะคะตลาดหลักทรัพย์เองในฐานะผู้ร่วมจัดหลักสูตรอบรม TCFD SDG Workshop มีวัตถุประสงค์ที่จะสร้างความรู้ความเข้าใจให้แก่บริษัทจดทะเบียนเกี่ยวกับการเปิดเผยข้อมูลตามแนวทางของ Tcfd Recommendations นะคะซึ่งตัว Tcfd เองเนี่ยให้ความสำคัญเรื่องของการบริหารจัดการเกี่ยวกับเรื่องของ climate change แล้วก็ผลกระทบที่มีนัยสำคัญต่อการดำเนินธุรกิจทุกวันนี้เป็นที่ยอมรับกันดีอยู่แล้วนะคะว่าประเด็นเรื่องของ climate change เนี่ยเข้ามามีบทบาทแล้วก็ส่งผลกระทบต่อการดำเนินกิจการของบริษัทเป็นอย่างมากนะคะการเปิดเผยข้อมูลตาม TCFD Recommendations เนี่ยจึงนับว่ามีความสำคัญแล้วก็เป็นที่ต้องการมากขึ้นของผู้ลงทุนเพราะว่าการเปิดเผยข้อมูล Climate Risk นะคะโดยรวมถึงการกำหนดกลยุทธ์ตัวชี้วัดเป้าหมายต่างๆในการดำเนินงานเนี่ยจะสะท้อนให้เห็นว่าธุรกิจสามารถที่จะรับมือแล้วก็จัดการกับประเด็นเรื่องของ climate change ได้ดีเพียงใดนะคะตลาดทรัพย์เองเนี่ยได้จัดกิจกรรมเวิร์กช็อปครั้งนี้ขึ้นโดยอยากจะให้ทุกท่านเนี่ยมองว่าการเปิดเผยข้อมูลตาม TCFD สามารถทำได้โดยทำให้สอดคล้องกับมาตรฐานการเปิดเผยข้อมูลด้านความยั่งยืนที่แต่ละบริษัทเปิดเผยแล้วก็มีความคุ้นชินอยู่นะคะไม่ว่าจะเป็นการเปิดเผยข้อมูลตามรายงาน GRI Standard นะคะหรือแม้แต่ SDG หรือ CDP นะคะเพราะฉะนั้นเวิร์กช็อปในครั้งนี้จึงมุ่งยกระดับการเปิดเผยข้อมูลด้านความยั่งยืนที่ท่านเปิดเผยอยู่แล้วนะคะให้สามารถสอดคล้องไปกันกับแนวทางของที่ TCFD recommend เอาไว้นะคะเนื้อหาของเวิร์กช็อปที่จัดในวันนี้จึงเน้นเรื่องของการปูพื้นฐานความรู้เพื่อสร้างความรู้ความเข้าใจเกี่ยวกับเรื่องของคอนเซ็ปต์แนวคิดแล้วก็องค์ประกอบของการรายงานตาม TCFD นะคะรวมไปถึงแนวทางการกำหนดกลยุทธ์การดำเนินธุรกิจวิธีการเริ่มรายงานตามแนวทาง TCFD ของบริษัทจดทะเบียนไทยนอกจากนี้ยังมีการยกตัวอย่างกรณีศึกษาของบริษัทที่ได้เปิดเผยข้อมูลตาม GRI และ SDG อยู่แล้วนะคะว่าสามารถสอดคล้องไปกับแนวทางของ TCFD ได้ด้วยนะคะกิจกรรมเวิร์กช็อปที่จัดในวันนี้เนี่ยรวมถึงพรุ่งนี้ด้วยนะคะถือว่าเป็นการอบรมในรอบ beginners นะคะตลาดทรัพย์จะจัดอีกรอบหนึ่งนะคะเป็นรอบ advance ในวันที่22แล้วก็23มิถุนายนนะคะก็ถือโอกาสเชิญชวนทุกท่านนะคะเข้าร่วมเวิร์กช็อปเป็นอย่างต่อเนื่องนะคะเพราะว่าเราอยากจะให้ทุกบริษัทได้รับความรู้อย่างเต็มที่แล้วก็สามารถเอาข้อมูลความรู้ต่างๆเหล่านี้นะคะไปปรับใช้นะคะเพื่อที่จะยกระดับการดำเนินงานของบริษัทนะคะรวมถึงไปปรับปรุงคุณภาพเรื่องของการเปิดเผยข้อมูลความยั่งยืนของบริษัทอีกด้วยนะคะนั้นเราก็หวังว่าสิ่งต่างๆเหล่านี้ที่เราได้รับความรู้นะคะจะเป็นการเสริมสร้างความรู้ความสามารถในการแข่งขันรวมถึงว่าบริษัทจะได้รับการยอมรับมากขึ้นนะคะจากผู้ลงทุนและผู้มีส่วนได้เสียอื่นๆสุดท้ายนี้นะคะตลาดทรัพย์ขอขอบคุณ UK Pact Green Recovery Challenge Fund นะคะที่สนับสนุนการจัดกิจกรรมให้ความรู้เพื่อสนับสนุน Sustainable Finance แล้วก็ Transition Economy สำหรับประเทศไทยนะคะขอขอบคุณ CDP GRI ซึ่งเป็นหน่วยงานผู้ร่วมจัดงานแล้วก็ให้เกียรติเป็นวิทยากรในวันนี้นะคะนอกจากที่ทุกท่านที่เป็นวิทยากรจะมาบรรยายให้ท่านทราบแล้วก็ยังเปิดโอกาสให้ท่านได้ซักถามข้อสงสัยนะคะก็อยากเชิญชวนให้ท่านได้เปิดใช้โอกาสนี้นะคะซักถามข้อสงสัยต่างๆที่มีนะคะแล้วก็หวังอย่างยิ่งว่าทุกท่านจะได้รับประโยชน์อย่างเต็มที่จากเวิร์กช็อปทั้ง2วันนี้ค่ะขอบคุณมากค่ะ
Thank you very much, Kun Ratwali, for the welcoming and opening remarks. And again, a big thank you to the Stock Exchange of Thailand, who is a key partner for us to successfully implement this capacity building program. Next, I'm also pleased to introduce Ms. Alexandra McKenzie, Deputy Head of Mission with the British Embassy in Bangkok, for opening remarks. Alexandra took up her appointment as Deputy Ambassador at the British Embassy in Bangkok in August 2020. She joined the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in 2002 and has spent her career focusing on Europe and Asia, with postings to Beijing, Paris, Berlin, and Singapore. So without further ado, over to you, Alexandra.
Hi, good morning. Very nice to see you all. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Konrad Bali, for your opening remarks, and also to you, Frederick, as well, for the fantastic introduction. And it's really good to hear how everything will be really outcome focused over the course of this workshop. I think that's fantastic that you give everyone a real sense of purpose. So it's a great pleasure to see representatives from Thailand's leading business community attend this seminar. Over the past year, we have seen scientists, academics, pharmaceutical companies, and governments work together at unprecedented speed in a race to develop COVID-19 vaccines. And this is a task that was seen as nearly impossible in March 2020, but it has been achieved through urgency, innovation, and collective action. And we believe that we have to bring that same sense of urgency and collaboration to tackling climate change. While the world grapples with the pandemic, it's easy to postpone considering the risks of climate change. But we all know that the impacts will be much greater than those that we're currently suffering. International research shows that Thailand is among the 10 countries most at risk from climate change. Sea levels are rising approximately 4 millimeters a year in the Gulf of Thailand, which already puts the country in more danger compared to the global average rise of 3.3 millimeters. I'm sure many of you will have seen a report late last year that Bangkok will be underwater by 2050. But the World Bank estimates that 40% of the city could be inundated as soon as 2030. This would mean approximately 12 million people in Thailand, or 17% of Thailand's total population, vulnerable to rising sea levels and needing to relocate. On the other hand, the major drought in 2020 led to a 4.8% reduction in agricultural growth, which caused rice prices in Thailand to rise about 20% compared to 2019, reaching $550 a ton, the highest price since 2013. Floods and droughts will be increasingly common in the next years, and this is not a problem or a challenge for governments alone. If your company is in food production, risks related to climate change could have significant consequences for your business. If you have major real estate in Bangkok or along the seaboard as part of your business, you may be increasingly at risk. And of course, if you lend to, invest in, or insure these companies, you're at risk by extension. Companies around the world are embracing sustainable practices and climate-related disclosures because it's the right thing to do, the right thing for their risk management, the right thing for their investors, the right thing for the future. To date, for example, more than 2,000 companies, including Thai companies, have expressed their support for the disclosure of non-financial information in line with the recommendations from the TCFD. The number of companies that have signed up has increased by over 85% in a year. 60 of the world's 100 largest public companies already report in line with TCFD recommendations. Globally, energy companies are among those most likely to adopt TCFD-aligned disclosures. Governments, in turn, are embracing TCFD, seeking to support it as part of a wide move towards net zero. 110 countries, including the UK, have now moved to enshrine net zero emission targets in policy or law and are working on detailed plans. As COP presidency, the UK is committed to making TCFD-aligned disclosures mandatory across the economy by 2025, and among listed companies from 2023. We published a roadmap setting out our plan to achieve this last November. And in fact, from this year, all UK companies with premium stock exchange listings must state in their annual reports whether they have disclosed in line with TCFD recommendations. As the pressure mounts, many financial institutions will divest exposures to companies high emissions and instead invest in companies with low emissions. Those decisions, combined with demand from investors for non-financial information to support investment decisions, mean the demand for these disclosures is already significant. And it's now inevitable, therefore, that all companies will have to adapt their strategy to this new reality. Disclosing climate risks will be a necessary part of this, as part of any resilience and transition strategy. So I hope that today's workshop will provide valuable information on the benefit of disclosing financial climate-related risks for your company and help you seize the opportunities for transition to a sustainable and low-emission business model. I'd like to add my thanks to those of my colleagues to the Thailand Stock Exchange for this important partnership, and also to our speakers from CDP, GRI, and most importantly, our special guest speaker, Dr. Natakorn from PTT Global Chemical Public Company Limited, who will insight on how companies can implement the TCFD's recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Alexandra. And again, we are really excited to be working with you at the Embassy and the UK PAC team to develop this program. And we look forward to working closely with you in the year ahead. Moving on to the training session and content, I am pleased to introduce my colleague and CDP's Regional Director, Ms. Pratima Divgi. Pratima leads CDP's regional efforts in Hong Kong, Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. And in her role as director, she engaged with corporates, investors, and cities in their efforts to measure and manage their environmental impacts. In her previous career, Pratima spent 17 years in finance, where she also led work on formulation of the ESG policies, as well as policy implementation for Asia-Pacific private equity investments. So Pratima, please, over to you.
Thank you, Fred. Perhaps we can move to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I very much appreciate your attending today's event. I would like to start by especially thanking the British government and the Stock Exchange of Thailand for giving us the opportunity to develop and facilitate today's workshop. I won't delve into who CDP is, as my colleagues Joe and Fred will cover that in the later sections. They will also touch upon how we are working with capital markets, financial institutions, and companies in Asia Pacific on climate change and environmental factors. Over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I will focus my conversation on 3 areas. The first is the urgency for countries and regions to develop climate resilience. The second is what countries are already doing in this regard. And the third is how companies are responding to policy requirements, but also integrating climate strategies in business. As you are probably already aware, the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015 by over 190 nations. The focus of the agreement is to limit the pace of global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. And to achieve this goal, countries are committing to taking action through what is known as nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. When a country such as Thailand provides its NDC goals, it specifies the actions that it will take to reduce emissions, but it also provides action plans to develop resilience to climate change. Effects of climate change are already being felt globally, and it is now impacting some countries much more than others. This slide shows the countries that have, over the past 19 years, been particularly affected by climate change. 5 out of the 10 most impacted countries are from Asia. This includes Thailand, which faces climate change not just from the view of extreme weather events, but also long-term changing weather patterns. It probably comes as no surprise that more than 75% of global capital stock that could be damaged from riverine flooding in a given year comes from Asia. Today, more than 70 countries are working on establishing policies for net zero emissions by 2050. In fact, of these, 2 countries have already achieved carbon neutrality, and 6 countries have incorporated net zero emission targets into their legislation. Countries have also begun to mention carbon pricing in their NDCs, and this indicates that they are either planning or considering the use of carbon markets or domestic carbon pricing to meet their Paris goals. As an example, Singapore has already introduced a carbon tax. The carbon tax is currently low to allow companies to incorporate this within their business. It is set at 5 Singapore dollars per ton of greenhouse gas emissions from 2019 to 2023. And then there are plans to increase this tax between 10 and 15 Singapore dollars per ton of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. In line with the NDC goals, Thailand has also committed to specific actions on emissions reductions and climate change adaptation. Using 2025 as a base year, Thailand will aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 20 to 25% by 2030. Thailand is also developing a long-term low greenhouse gas emissions development strategy. Through this strategy, Thailand will then aim for a more enhanced reduction target in its subsequent NDC submissions. Besides national level action, another area for consideration for companies is that the financial systems globally are also coming together to understand the risks of climate change in financial portfolios. In 2017, central banks came together to understand these climate-related financial risks. Today, 77 central banks are part of this coalition under the Network for Greening the Financial System. Thailand's central bank is part of the network, while China's central bank and Singapore's monetary authority are both on its steering committee. In Asia Pacific particularly, central banks of China, Malaysia, and Singapore have come out publicly in favor of climate and green finance. Just to provide an example, in its 2020 paper, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority showcased how climate change is intrinsically linked with existing banking risks. As you see here, and just to give an example again, banks could face credit risks on collateralized assets that are impacted by extreme weather events, and this could lead to a fall in market value. Similar such risks are identified for businesses that are affected by what we call as drivers of climate change. And this could include technology, it could include climate policy, as well as market sentiment. As a result of these central bank guidelines, financial institutions have started integrating and financially evaluating climate change issues when investing or providing loans to companies. And as a result of this, companies have started to voluntarily report on climate-related financial risks and low carbon opportunities. Regulators and policymakers in Asia Pacific are also moving towards increased disclosure on climate issues that affect companies. In this regard, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD framework, is commonly known. It has now emerged as a gold standard. And the reason why the TCFD is receiving so much of an uptake is because of what I term as 2 reasons. The first is the TCFD framework provides companies the ability to assess financial impacts of climate change on their business operations. These financial impacts may be negative, such as disruption in current business activities. But these financial impacts would also be positive, for example, through low carbon opportunities and cost savings through resource efficiency. The second reason why the TCFD framework is also receiving universal acceptance is because it enables companies not just to report, but to also integrate these climate assessments within their existing business strategies. As you see on the slide, some regions have already started implementing TCFD to enhance disclosure and the use of climate information in financial decisions. New Zealand became the first country in the world to mandate TCFD reporting, but recently, Malaysia and Hong Kong have both come out publicly in favor of TCFD reporting, and we expect other Asian markets to follow over the next couple of years. Companies often ask us, how does the TCFD reporting fit within existing ESG and sustainability reporting frameworks? This slide provides a simple and effective way, I think, to establish the building blocks of corporate reporting. At the bottom left square is financial reporting. All companies are required to report on the financial health of their operations. Building on this are ESG metrics that financially impact business operations. And this is where the TCFD framework comes in as it relates to financial reporting of climate risks and opportunities. And overlaying this are the broader ESG metrics, such as the GRI standards, that provide insights on a company's positive and negative contributions to sustainable development. As I mentioned earlier, the TCFD framework is a reporting exercise, but it also integrates very well within existing business strategies. It is for this reason that we feel the TCFD links with a company's enterprise risk management framework. If your company already has a long-term strategy developed, this slide shows how the TCFD framework fits into your existing strategy. Let's take governance and culture, for example. We find through our reporting that companies in Asia are now already identifying and reporting which board member and senior management own the climate strategy and are responsible and have KPIs for making business operations resilient to climate change. Likewise, a company's strategy and objectives fit very well within TCFD's climate scenario planning, as it aims to conduct vulnerability assessments and estimate climate-related negative and positive financial impact. Metrics and targets identified under the TCFD fit into a company's performance goals. So companies can then assess current targets and consider future revisions to their TCFD roadmaps. And finally, the TCFD serves as a standalone report within the organization, but also to investors and stakeholders, where you can demonstrate that your company has robust procedures to understand the financial impacts of climate change. It showcases how you have assessed whether these climate impacts are severe or not to your business operations. And thirdly, what is the monitoring process that you have in place to mitigate risks and to capitalize on business opportunities related to low carbon. With this, I conclude my session, and I hope it provided sufficient backdrop on the need for companies to develop climate-related business and financial strategies. My colleague, Joseph Gualtieri, will now discuss the various concepts of the TCFD framework and how companies are practically developing climate strategies and reporting through the TCFD. Joe, I'll pass this on to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pratima. And Thanks to FCO and SET and UK Pact for making this event possible. And of course, thank you to all of you who are joining us today. It's really great to see so much interest in TCFD disclosure among Thai companies. So my name is Joe, and I'm on CDP's corporate reporting team here in Hong Kong. And over the next few minutes, I'll just briefly introduce the TCFD. I'll highlight some of the key elements of TCFD disclosure, and we'll point towards potential future developments with TCFD reporting. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the TCFD, it may be useful to quickly recap what the TCFD is and how it fits into global efforts to limit climate change. So as Pratima mentioned, the TCFD has its origins in the Paris Agreement of 2015, which saw over 190 companies make nationally determined contributions in the effort to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And to that end, the G20 finance ministers tasked the Financial Stability Board, or FSB, with reviewing how climate-related risks were priced and accounted for in the capital markets. And this is done with the goal to better understand climate-related risks to stability of the global financial system. And in short, the FSB found that companies were underreporting climate risks and that the capital markets lacked the information necessary to understand and manage the uncertainties associated with climate change. And so in order to address this gap, the FSB created the TCFD in order to identify the information needed by investors, lenders, insurance underwriters, and others to appropriately assess risk and price climate-related risks and opportunities. In some practical terms, what this meant was developing a set of global guidelines for reporting on how climate change impacts corporate performance. And the task force was made up of representatives from corporations, auditors, insurers, banks, and other key players in the capital markets. And in 2017, the TCFD issued a set of disclosure recommendations, which are centered around the 4 pillars that you see here to the right. And these thematic areas really represent the core of TCFD disclosure and should be understood as a holistic set of recommendations designed to work together in service of greater transparency. So the governance pillar asks companies to disclose the roles and responsibilities of the board and senior management team with respect to managing climate-related risks. Strategy disclosure asks companies to report how their strategic and financial planning are impacted by climate-related risks and opportunities over various time horizons. In terms of risk management, TCFD recommends companies to report on their processes for quantifying and managing these risks within the context of their overall risk management systems. And finally, companies can address the metrics and targets pillar by disclosing how they track their impact on climate change, as well as their practices for setting and achieving climate targets. And before we go into the specific recommendations that underpin these 4 pillars, let's take a quick look at the guiding principles behind the TCFD recommendations. So we have here a brief overview of some of the key ideas and themes behind the recommendations. And again, the purpose of these animating principles really is to provide company stakeholders with clear, comparable, and decision-useful information on actual and possible impacts of climate change on the reporting company. So the recommendations were originally intended to be voluntary, and they remain so in most jurisdictions. Although, as Pratima and Alexandra mentioned, regulators worldwide have shown interest in making TCFD disclosure mandatory. And we'll talk more about that in a later slide. Climate-related disclosure should be robust, comprehensive, and accessible in the same manner that financial filings are required to be and should be included in mainstream reports. The recommendations were initially targeted to certain sectors that were seen to have an outsized impact on the climate, and these sectors still remain a priority, although companies from all sectors are increasingly expected to report. Disclosing companies are also expected to consider and report on both on physical risks and transition risks. I'll talk more about these later, but briefly, physical risks relate to the risks caused directly by changes in the climate, whereas transition risks refer to those risks associated with the shift to a low carbon economy. Also, a TCFD report should be forward-looking. It should communicate the company's vision for addressing risks and seizing opportunities, ideally through the use of scenario analysis, which again, we'll talk about in just a moment. And because climate change poses risks that may not align with typical business and credit cycles, data reported should be relevant across various long-term time horizons. And finally, fulsome disclosures should contain both quantitative and qualitative elements. So each of the recommended disclosures call for a different balance of these types of information. So as I mentioned, the recommendations were initially targeted to specific sectors, and these targets fall into two buckets. We have the financial group and the non-financial group. In the financial group, the aim is for these companies to report on their financed emissions. So banks will reveal emissions associated with their lending, and insurers will look at underwritten emissions. Asset owners will report on emissions associated with their investments, while asset managers will report on the climate implications of their asset management practices. And the purpose in targeting the financial institutions in particular is both to more accurately price climate risks and also, importantly, to allocate capital towards firms with a low carbon intensity. And it's fine that measuring and reporting the relevant data helps these firms to avoid risk and identify investment opportunities that align with the realities of climate change. Sectors in the non-financial sector group are especially carbon and energy intensive. And so these sectors are also particularly important with respect to Thailand because over 50% of Thailand's gross emissions are caused by the energy and transportation sectors. And like financial institutions, companies in these sectors benefit by identifying and avoiding risks and positioning themselves to better seize opportunities. And this naturally leads to a greater capacity to attract capital for growth. So while these industries remain a priority, the list is not exhaustive, and companies with similar environmental profiles are also encouraged to disclose. And since disclosure expectations from investors and other stakeholders, including regulators, are increasingly tied to market cap rather than sector, companies from all sectors really should begin reporting. So with that context, let's take a look at the recommendations themselves. Here we have each of the 4 pillars, and below them, the 11 recommended disclosures that underpin these pillars. So starting from the left in the governance pillar, the TCFD asks companies to disclose the governance structures and mechanisms used to address climate issues. And specifically, the recommendations ask about the board level oversight of climate issues and also the management's role in assessing and managing climate-related risks. And we often tell companies that are new to reporting that they can start by disclosing existing governance structures and work to incorporate strengthened governance measures over time. And many companies will begin this by publishing a policy or a commitment statement on climate change. Moving to the strategy pillar, companies are asked to disclose the actual and potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities within the context of their organization's business, strategy, and financial planning. So to break that down a bit, essentially the recommended disclosures ask what are the risks that you have identified over various timeframes? Then having identified these risks, how have you estimated their impacts? And then given these impact assessments, what is your strategy to guard against or address these risks? And with this pillar, early stage companies can begin by carrying out reduction initiatives with their operational GHG emissions, and of course joining global and domestic initiatives that seek to mitigate climate change as they develop a strategy to address climate issues. The next pillar, risk management, asks companies to disclose how the organization identifies, assesses, and manages climate-related risks. And here, in essence, you're asked to report how it is that you assess and identify risks. What are the processes involved, and how do they relate to both physical and transition-related risks? What systems and processes are used to monitor and manage these risks? How do issues of climate risk fit into your overall corporate risk management system? And here, companies that are new to these issues will tend to begin by acknowledging the need to assess and respond to climate-related risks and assembling internal teams, even if they lack the capacity to do so initially. And finally, with respect to metrics and targets, the TCFD asks companies to disclose these metrics and targets that are used to assess and manage climate-related risks and opportunities. So here the TCFD is asking for identification of the measurements and tools used to measure climate risks and opportunities. Also, what are these emissions? Reporting the emissions, whether they're direct emissions, which we term as scope 1 and 2 emissions, or if they're indirect emissions, which we term scope 3 emissions. Those are the emissions embedded in the value chain. And look into what risks is this, do these footprints expose you to? And then having established how you measure your emissions and what those measurements indicate, what targets have you established to improve performance, and how do you measure progress against those targets? And in this case, companies can begin by assessing their direct emissions and then use this as a baseline for further progress. So having looked at the recommended disclosures rather, we can now consider how the TCFD links this climate data on risks and opportunities, which you'll find above the dotted line in this graphic, with the financial impact elements below the dotted line. So starting from the left, as I mentioned, TCFD divides climate-related risks into these two classes. So again, the transition risks related to a transition to a low-carbon economy, and the physical risks, which again are associated with the physical implications of climate change. And TCFD breaks these classes down into a few subclasses. So for transition risks, this means policy and legal risks, like for example, increased pricing of GHG emissions, as well as risks related to technology, including the costs associated with switching to lower emissions equipment, for example. And there are also market and reputational risks, which are associated with changing consumer and stakeholder attitudes. Physical risks we can break down into acute risks, and these are event-driven episodes like severe weather, tornadoes, and so forth, and chronic risks. And these risks refer to longer-term shifts in precipitation, temperature, and weather patterns. So it's important to note that at the same time as these risks are very real and present, climate change does bring opportunities, and some of these will come in the form of opportunities for greater energy efficiency and access to new energy sources. Opportunities can also appear as low emissions products that can be offered, as well as services, and access to new markets. And this is becoming particularly important as an increasing number of jurisdictions set ambitious and even net zero targets. And opportunities for greater resilience, for example, through diversification, can also present themselves. So the idea here is that whatever the company and its particular circumstances, these risks and opportunities really do have a direct impact on the company's financial elements listed below. So for example, in terms of corporate income statements, changes in customer demands could lead to increased revenues for companies that offer low emissions goods and services. On the other hand, legal and policy developments could raise expenditure in the form of higher compliance and legal costs. With respect to balance sheets, physical risks, whether acute or chronic, could cause the early retirement or write-off of assets, either through damage or because assets are understood to be in high-risk locations. On the other hand, companies switching to new energy sources could enjoy expanded access to capital as investors increasingly favor low-carbon energy generation. So in short, climate change will present each company with a unique set of risks and opportunities, and the TCFD reporting mechanism enables all companies to consider how risks and opportunities affect its current and future financial positions. So I hope this gives you some understanding of the background and goals of the TCFD. And so we'll now focus on some of the key elements of TCFD reporting. So one of the most important concepts in TCFD reporting is materiality. And this is important because materiality determines which information should be included in your disclosure. And this is in part determined by the intended audience of the report. So for example, the International Account Standards Board, or provides that information should be considered material if omitting, misstating, or obscuring it could reasonably be expected to influence the decision of primary users of the report. So in other words, information is material if excluding or compromising this information could cause users to make decisions that they may otherwise not have made had they not provided this information. Sorry. Information is financially material specifically to the extent this information is necessary for an understanding of the company's development, performance, and position. And climate data is therefore considered financially material inasmuch as environmental conditions impact company performance. Now, in contrast, environmental and social materiality extends this idea to include the impact of the company on the environment. And the concept of double materiality encompasses both the impact of the company on the environment and vice versa. And GRI, for example, takes the more expansive view of materiality. Given that the primary audience for TCFD reports is actors in the capital markets, the TCFD focuses on financial materiality. But nevertheless, we encourage companies to bear in mind the impacts that their actions have on the planet, as company impacts on climate can be financially material when these impacts have consequences on company performance. Okay. So another feature of TCFD disclosure is that reports are meant to be forward-looking. A key method in preparing forward-looking disclosures is the use of climate-related scenario analysis, which enables companies to develop plans in the context of uncertainty with respect to future climatic conditions. And scenario analysis gives companies the opportunity to explore the implications of alternatives to business as usual assumptions and practices. So a scenario describes a pathway of development that leads to a particular outcome. So 1.5 degree scenario, for example, would include assumptions concerning the changes that would be necessary to achieve a world with limited changes to the climate. And scenario analysis is a tool to enhance critical strategic thinking, and again should be understood as narratives based on multiple scenarios and assumptions. So depending on the different scenarios, there will be a set of assumptions made about the future and the actions taken by, for example, regulators and customers. Companies then analyze how their business would fare under these different conditions. The TCFD guidelines ask companies to consider the different pathways toward a 2 degree or lower scenario in order to understand the resilience of a company's strategy. This will show users of the report that the company has a plan to thrive as the climate changes. Investors and regulators, of course, do not expect companies to have a crystal ball, but carrying out and reporting on climate-related scenario analysis shows stakeholders that a company is prepared for a variety of future climate conditions and demonstrates transparency concerning the company's resilience in the face of possible futures. What is important is not so much the credibility or exact results of the scenario analysis, but rather the company showing potential responses to expected futures. Of course, it's impossible to predict the future, but what companies can do is ensure that their businesses and strategies are resilient to potential risks that will arise no matter whether we find ourselves on a 1.5 degree trajectory or a 3.4 degree trajectory. So we'll take a brief look just a little bit more closely at climate scenarios. And so in short, a climate scenario will lay out possible future states that differ by the level of warming predicted. And so the graph on the left illustrates how different emissions levels lead to different temperature outcomes. So the business as usual outcomes are represented in gray, and the reductions needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees are indicated in yellow and green. And to the right, we have some of the risks associated with the 1.5 and 2 degree warming scenarios. So as you can see, risks across all indicators multiply as the temperatures increase. These projections enable companies to really think through future climatic conditions and the impact of these conditions on corporate performance. So for example, the percentage of global population facing extreme heat under a 2 degree scenario is more than double the percentage under a 1.5 degree scenario. And investors and regulators in this case will want to know whether companies have plans for each of these outcomes. And so of course, while it's important to understand each of these scenarios and associated risks in detail, and to consider what they may mean to your business, the key point for now is that no matter which scenario we use in the analysis, there will always be some risks associated with climate change. And increasingly, the capital markets expect companies to have plans to navigate these risks. Next slide, please. So just to look at this a little bit more closely, is using scenario analysis helps companies to understand the risks and opportunities associated with the different climate trajectories. It might be helpful just to take, again, a closer look at the the role that assumptions play in scenarios. So all scenarios and scenario analyses include certain assumptions and analytical methods. And so companies are asked to detail these when reporting the use and results of scenario analysis. So here we have a simple chart showing some of the risks and assumptions associated with a 1.5 degree scenario. That is to say, a series of assumptions on what changes to business as usual practices would lead to global temperature increase of 1.5 degrees. And a 3.4 degree scenario, which again carries a series of assumptions on what would need to happen to yield warming of 3.4 degrees. So without going into too much detail about the assumptions and risks with each of these scenarios, we can see that they do present a very different set of risks. So in the 1.5 degree scenario, for example, it's indicated that an orderly transition expedited with instruments like a carbon tax and changes in the energy supply and development of green technologies. And on the other hand, the disorderly 3.4 degree scenario anticipates fewer changes in climate policy and energy supply, but correspondingly more extreme physical risks in the shape of Arctic melting, crop failures, and widespread flooding. And clearly, the strategies needed to adapt to a 1.5 degree scenario would be quite different from the strategy needed to adapt to a 3.4 degree scenario. And companies may want to or will want to report varying degrees of resilience for each scenario. And again, this is why the TCFD recommends carrying out scenario analysis using a variety of scenarios and across a number of different timeframes. Okay, so I hope that gives you some sense of the key features of TCFD reporting. And so now I'd just like to turn briefly to how the TCFD has been rolled out and what we can expect in the future. So here we have the implementation path envisaged by the TCFD upon the launch of the recommendations in 2017. And expectations included widespread adoption of the framework and use of tools like scenario analysis, and overall reporting comprehensive, complete, and consistent information within the 5-year timeframe. And the implementation path indicated a broad understanding of, among the capital markets players, of the concentration of carbon-related assets in the financial system. In reality, as we'll see on the next slide, levels of reporting have not quite reached expectations, and the data quality can be uneven, although significant progress has been made. Nonetheless, companies may wish to use this implementation chart to determine where their organization sits on the path and to determine next steps. So for example, if your company is just beginning to consider climate-related issues, one next step would be to drive within the company greater integration of climate issues in strategic considerations. This would then better position your company to establish the metrics and targets necessary to more fully understand and ultimately manage your emissions profile. And of course, this will be important both in terms of better managing your own climate risks, but also as well as keeping up with peer companies as the scale and quality of TCFD reporting continues to grow. So that was the anticipated implementation path. We'll now take a brief look at the what we found to be the actual implementation since the recommendations were issued. And to do that, we can refer to the TCFD's 2020 status report. This was written to assess the current status of disclosure practices, highlight challenges, and overall give a comprehensive view of the state of play. And the paper examined reports for 1,100 companies across 142 countries and 8 sectors between 2017 and 2019. And the TCFD also surveyed companies on efforts to implement the recommendations and expert users on the usefulness and relevance of TCFD disclosures. The key findings were that nearly 60% of the top 100 companies globally either support the TCFD, reported in line with the TCFD, or both. And one of the things that this suggests is that releasing a TCFD-aligned report is increasingly seen as a best practice. among all companies, energy companies and materials and building companies led on disclosure. And much of this progress has been driven by investor efforts. So although there is some good news, further progress clearly is still needed. So in particular, companies' disclosure of the potential financial impact of climate change on their business and strategy remains low. Only about 1 in 15 companies provided information on the resilience of strategy, suggesting that some of the blind spots of the TCFD was designed to address nonetheless still exist. And despite these gaps, expert users found that the financial impact of climate change on a company's business and strategy were considered the most useful elements of the report for decision making. And these experts also identified information about the company's material climate related issues for each sector and each geography, and the key metrics used as critical for decision making. We'll just go to the next slide, please. So I'll wrap up briefly, having looked at where the TCFD began and the current state of implementation, with a view towards what we can expect in the near future. So as Pratima mentioned, we have seen a diverse set of territories in the region, including New Zealand, Hong Kong, and Malaysia, begin to strengthen their reporting requirements. And as Alexandra pointed out, the UK is also taking bold steps in this direction. In the US, we have the Senate and the Securities and Exchange Commission considering actions to strengthen disclosure requirements, whereas in Canada, a government-sponsored panel has recommended a comply or explain approach, and the government has also incorporated climate reporting into its COVID eligibility process for COVID recovery funds. Similarly, in the European Union, the TCFD is considering incorporating the TCFD into its directive on non-financial reporting. And in Australia, both the Australian Securities and Investments Commission and the Australian Accounting Standards Board have either rewritten their rules or provided guidance on how to incorporate climate risks into financial reporting. And in Japan, over the past several years, there's been a TCFD summit, and regulators are also encouraging companies to integrate TCFD into their reporting processes. So just to wrap up, as governments adopt various means to require climate risk reporting and investors continue to show interest in this reporting, beginning the process of TCFD reporting now really will be critical to both staying ahead of both regulatory environments and meeting investor expectations. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'm just going to make sure. Okay, great. And sorry, I skipped a few slides there. Let me sort this out again. So yeah, thank you very much, Joe, for that introduction to the TCFD. In the next section of the workshop, we will share how your organization can use CDP as a tool to start developing your own roadmap and reporting in alignment with these TCFD recommendations. However, before that, we will have some time for Q&A, and then we will have a short break since we have a long program today. So I see that we have some questions already in the Q&A box, but if you have any questions, please feel free to click on the button on the bottom of the screen where it says Q&A, and you can post your questions there. So we will also have a Q&A section later in the workshop today. So the first question that we have received is the disclosure of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. Do they need to be put in the same report? That's a good question that we often get. And the answer is yes, the report should contain information about all of these 4 pillars. So this is important for the investment community who came up with these recommendations to be able to access the information and evaluate your company's disclosure in a centralized way. And this is also where, as I will talk about after the break, where CDP can help. CDP provides a disclosure platform and an online questionnaire that is fully aligned with the TCFD recommendations. So it's an opportunity to then provide a disclosure where all of the 4 pillars and the 11 corresponding recommendations are disclosed on in a centralized location. And in the TCFD also recommends that this disclosure it's encouraged to be included in your mainstream financial filings. So that was one question. Another one we have here, let me see. We have some similar also to what we will be talking about after the break. So for example, can you explain how a beginner can start their journey in environmental disclosure? Again, I will save the answer for this until after the break, because we will go more into detail about this. Let me see here. And yeah, my colleagues, anyone from the team, if you also have received any questions, please feel free to jump in. And let's see here. Okay, so we have another question here asking, can we give some more examples of what opportunities relating to resilience means? So this can, for example, be opportunities relating to resilience can, for example, be changing to renewable energy sources. So we've seen companies report on opportunities in the past where, because they have increased their share of renewable consumption, they are less dependent on the grid and therefore less dependent on fluctuations in the price from in their scope 2 emissions. And so this enables companies to have a more stable and predictable approach to their energy consumption. And another one relating to resilience that we can mention is also similarly related to energy, but it's also on resource efficiency. So we see more and more companies implementing initiatives to improve their efficiency and thereby reduce their intensity of emissions consumption and building their resilience that way. Another question is, please share how the CDP disclosure and CDP indices and how this is linked and benefits to the companies. Again, this is something that we will go more in detail to after the break. So I'm glad that you are asking this. And let's see here. Joe, maybe I'll pass this one to you. So according to the TCFD framework, the components should include governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. What can a company do that only have some of these components in place? Any information that you can share on that, Joe?
Sure. Yeah, and that's a really important question, because we know, a lot of companies may not have all the resources necessary to assemble the full set of information that we would expect of a more mature reporting company. Generally speaking, the advice that we tend to give is the first step will be to form an internal working group, right? So once you've done this, you can make sure that you have the sort of buy-in across the organization that will be necessary to start gathering this information, if it's with respect to risks and opportunities and metrics and targets, or to start putting in place the advocating to put in place the governance structures that might be required. After that, we tend to recommend that companies put together, having assembled this group, undertake a gap analysis, and then that will give you a better sense of what exactly it is that you're missing, and then you can then go forward in terms of looking at the recommendations, looking at the best practices that are being pursued by other organizations, either in your sector or or in Thailand or the various geographies that you work in. In a later section, both my colleague Fred will talk about how CDP in particular could be used for this purpose, and then also we'll go over some of the resources published by TCFD, CDSB, and other organizations that can help you get started.
Yes, thank you very much, Joe. We have a lot of good questions. Sorry, Joe, I think you're still on mute. Thank you. So yeah, we still have a lot of good questions coming in. We have also scheduled a longer Q&A session towards the end of the event. Then we have 30 minutes where we can go through all of the questions. And also many of these questions we will address in the second half of the workshop. So thank you very much for submitting all these questions, and please keep them coming and we will answer them throughout the event. But before we continue, let's have a 10-minute break. So let's come back by 10:45, please. And after the break, you can learn how you can use CDP's framework as a tool to develop your own roadmap towards TCFD aligned action and reporting. And we will also be getting a case study from PTT Global Chemical, and we will have a longer Q&A section. So thank you very much so far, and we will see you back here in 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Let's get started again. And in the previous part, my colleague Joe explained what the TCFD recommendations are and where they came from. In the following section, I will present more on how companies can use CDP's framework to build a roadmap towards TCFD alignment. To do that, first I will introduce CDP and what we do. So just to give you some short background, CDP was founded in 2003 and is now the largest platform for self-reported corporate environmental data in the world. So in short, CDP provides an online platform and questionnaire where companies can report on their environmental performance. Since we started about 20 years ago, we now have the most comprehensive collection of self-reported data, and CDP is by many considered the gold standard for third-party environmental reporting. This slide shows how we work with companies. So starting from the left, CDP reach out to companies on behalf of our investor signatories who would like to better understand the environmental performance of organizations in which they are shareholders or that they are considering investing in. Screening a company for environmental metrics is now a fundamental action required by most large investors, such as institutional investors. And in addition to our investor signatories, we also reach out to suppliers on behalf of large purchasing organizations who reach out to CDP because they are interested in better understanding the environmental risks, impacts, and performance within their supply chains. So on behalf of these stakeholders, we reach out to companies to collect environmental data through our online questionnaire. The benefit of this is that our investors can access the data in a complete and centralized location, and importantly, in a standardized and comparable manner for their investment decision making. There are also many benefits for the companies who report through our platform, and many do it even if they are not requested by our investor signatories or their customers. So to give you a quick example, and I will get more into this in later slides, but because we collect the data through a standardized questionnaire that is aligned with global best practice in environmental management, companies can use it as a strategic tool to identify gaps in their own performance and reporting, and they can also use it to benchmark with their peers all over the world. And again, yeah, we will look more closely on this in the later slides. And just to give you an idea of the scope of CDP's work, despite the challenges of the COVID pandemic, 9,600 companies worldwide reported data through CDP's platform in 2020. Of these, about 3,000 companies were based across Asia Pacific, and the largest concentration was in the Greater China region. So it really shows, with 3,000 companies across Asia Pacific reporting, it really shows the momentum of environmental action here. In Thailand, 48 companies reported environmental data through CDP last year. We now have also nearly 600 investor signatories with more than 110 trillion US dollars in assets. And we have over 200 supply chain members, who we call it, with over 5.5 trillion US dollars in purchasing powers, who we are requesting this data on behalf of. And also, just to show you the growth in corporate environmental reporting since CDP first started about 20 years ago. And I include this slide to illustrate the momentum that we have seen from companies in the last 2 decades when it comes to environmental disclosure and reporting. And as you can see from the slide, 2020 on the right-hand side, the momentum has only increased. And there is no doubt that we have passed the threshold where corporate environmental management was considered a nice to have, and we have now moved to it being a fundamental pillar for most listed companies, especially those with a global presence. As I mentioned earlier, in addition to our investor signatories who benefit from receiving the data, there's also many benefits to the companies themselves who report through our platform. So for example, by reporting through a standardized framework, you will be able to much more accurately benchmark and learn from your peers as to identify where you are performing well and which areas you can improve in. This is possible not just because of the standardization, but also because of our scoring methodology, which is illustrated on this slide. So all companies who submit a response to CDP by the scoring deadline will receive a letter score from D to A, where A is the highest score. And importantly, the score is not intended to say if a company is bad or good. Rather, it is designed to highlight where on the journey to environmental leadership the company is. We fully recognize that the environmental action, it's not something that's done overnight. It takes time, and that is what our scoring methodology is designed to reflect and to help with. So to go through it a little bit, on the bottom of the pyramid, you can see our disclosure band, which is a D score. The disclosure band measures the completeness of your CDP response. Essentially, it really assesses the company's ability to collect and report environmental data. The next level is the awareness band, which represents companies who are not only able to collect the data, but who also have mechanisms in place to assess relevant environmental issues. And companies in this band are awarded with a C score, as shown on the left. Third is the management band, which represent companies who have implemented actions to mitigate the environmental issues that they have identified. And companies on this level are awarded with the B score. And then finally is our leadership band, which only about 2 to 5% of companies are able to obtain. This level represent companies who are raising the bar for corporate environmental action and are taking best practice steps such as implementing ambitious greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets that are aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. These types of targets are what we refer to as science-based targets, which we will talk more about later in this capacity building program. And companies on the leadership level are awarded with the A score. In 2020, only 277 companies worldwide made it to CDP's A list for their disclosure to our TCFD aligned questionnaire. And among them were PTT Global Chemical from Thailand, which we will hear more from later in this workshop. So by receiving a score, you can use it as an indicator to understand where your company is located in this journey towards environmental leadership as defined by CDP and to compare with other companies. And here you can see an example of the score feedback you will receive when you respond to CDP's online questionnaire. As you can see, you do not just get an overall score, but you get 11 different category scores, which are then added together to give you the overall score. On the left-hand side of the slide, the graph is showing a typical B score, and on the right-hand side, you can see the performance of typical C score company. So these spider graphs can allow you to break down your score further and get quick and easy insights into where you are performing well and where you can focus your efforts to improve. And finally, for transparency, credibility, and to help the companies who are responding to CDP, our scoring methodology is also publicly available in full on our website. So this way, anyone can see how every question in the questionnaire is assessed and scored. And also to avoid any conflict of interest, CDP do not score the responses ourselves. We develop the scoring methodology, then we will hire and train third-party scoring partners to do the scoring for us. So yeah, just on the screen to highlight how credible is CDP. And in 2020, CDP was again rated #1 for highest quality in the updated Rate the Raters report, which is produced by Sustainability. And this is a survey of sustainability experts, and the question asks them to rate different ESG ratings on the screen by quality, and CDP was ranked as #1. And you can go to the website if you're interested to have a closer look at this report. And yeah, finally, before we move into the TCFD again, as I said in the beginning, the data reported through CDP's platform is provided back to our investor signatories who use it for investment decision making. However, the public responses to CDP goes into many other hands as well across financial markets and civil society. So many of the major ESG research and ratings providers, such as Bloomberg Terminal, DJSI, FTSE Russell, and others, license data from CDP. So responding to the CDP online questionnaire will allow you to engage and communicate your environmental efforts to a much wider ecosystem. So that are some of the reasons why third-party platforms for reporting environmental data, such as CDP, can benefit your organization. But let's get back to the initial point. How can you use our platform and questionnaire as a tool to develop your own roadmap towards TCFD alignment? So just quickly to recap what my colleague Joe said before the break, this slide shows the 11 recommended disclosures that the TCFD came up with under each of the 4 pillars. So there are the 2 recommendations under the governance pillars on the left, and then there are 3 recommendations each for the strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets pillars. And companies who are able to report accurately and comprehensively against these 11 recommendations will take large steps in aligning with the current global best practice and meet the expectations of the global investor community when it comes to corporate environmental disclosure. The issue is that these recommendations are still somewhat up for interpretation, and many companies that we work with, they struggle to determine exactly what to report under each of these 11 recommendations. And this is where CDP can come in and provide some support. So CDP takes the 11 recommendations and turn them into specific questions in our questionnaire with clear guidance and assessment criteria. In other words, the TCFD recommendations provide guidelines for what investors want to know, and then CDP's questionnaire break down those guidelines into actionable metrics. This means that CDP can provide an ideal roadmap for companies who are looking to disclose on environmental issues. And again, also, we provide guidance and resources to support companies on their environmental journey. And finally, as we talked about earlier, companies are scored against our scoring methodology, which is aligned to global best practices, which can help you identify a really strong roadmap where you can find opportunities for improvements, strengths and weaknesses, and so forth. The outcome of the conversion from TCFD guidelines to the CDP questions is shown on the mapping slide here. Again, you can see the 4 TCFD pillars with the corresponding recommendations below each one. And then in red color, you can now see which questions within the CDP questionnaire that align to these recommendations. As you can see, there are roughly 50 questions within our questionnaires that companies should answer to ensure full alignment with the 11 recommended TCFD disclosures. This highlights the need for comprehensive reporting and to meet investor expectations. In the following slides, I will go through the 4 TCFD pillars and give you examples of what these questions look like, as well as what we consider best practice is. Please bear in mind, as this is an introductory workshop, we will not go very in-depth today. However, in our following workshops later in June and also later in the year, we will do some deep dives into some of these areas. So for example, the one in June, we will be focusing on climate risk assessments, how you can conduct these, what are other companies doing, and also climate related scenario analysis. What are the types of tools available? What are the scenarios and assumptions commonly used? And this is something that we will look much more closely at later in June. So without further ado, let's start with governance. So as Joe said, the governance pillar is intended to capture the governance structure of your company with regards to climate change, and it provides the data users with an understanding of the organization's approach to climate-related issues at the board and management levels. The slide on the screen shows a typical trajectory we often see companies go through to reach what we consider best practice in climate governance. Climate governance often starts with simply being a general topic on the agenda for board and management meetings. Next, from this, we often see targets and goals being established and set, especially by the board. This can be emission reduction targets or other types of environmental initiatives. After that, an important step is to implement mechanisms to be able to effectively not only implement, but also evaluate and assess what the company is doing at the management level to realize and achieve these goals and objectives. And then finally, we see the actual outcome of this work, ideally leading to improved environmental performance. Board level oversight of climate related issues is considered best practice, and it provides a strong indication of the importance of climate related issues to your organization. Here, you can see the TCFD recommendations under each of the governance pillar on the left-hand side of the screen, and you can see the corresponding questions in the CDP questionnaire that address these on the right-hand side. We ask companies whether there is board level oversight of climate issues within the organizations, as we just talked about. We ask what is the highest management level responsibility for managing these issues. And then we also drill down further to understand what are the specific roles of individual board and senior management positions when it comes to climate oversight and management. In addition, I have also included some of the response details that companies should include to make this a comprehensive response. So if you just look at the TCFD recommended disclosures at face value, some of them may seem simple, and some of them may even just seem like yes/no questions. However, it's important to include details and provide comprehensive answers to give a clear and transparent response. So in our questions, there is not only free text, but also drop-down options that the company should complete. So by answering all of these questions and drop-down options, you can talk more about, as shown on the screen, what is the frequency, which climate-related issues are discussed at the board level, what are the governance mechanisms in place to ensure that there is strong communications between the board, senior management, and implementing this into the organization as a whole. So by doing so, you can demonstrate that the issues that are taken at the board level are taken down the chain to management and effectively implemented, monitored, and reported out throughout the organization. To give you an example, we can look at City Developments Limited, or CDL's, reported governance structure for climate issues in their CDP response. So for background, CDL is a Singapore-listed international real estate operating company with a global presence spanning 29 countries and regions. On this slide, you can see an illustration of their climate governance structure. First, on the board level on the top, CDL has a board sustainability committee. It comprises 3 independent directors and the group CEO. This committee meets at least twice a year to review the company's ESG performance, including carbon performance, looking at potential risks and opportunities, including climate-related issues, and also to set strategic direction for implementation of various actions, including low-carbon initiatives. The board-level committee also receives a quarterly report and frequent updates of significant ESG trends and activities by the Chief Sustainability Officer from the management level. And then on the bottom of the screen, at the management level, CDL has a sustainability committee as well that is responsible for supporting the board and the company's ESG strategies, and also on measuring key performance indicators. So this committee is chaired by the CEO and reports to the group CEO and the board committee. So this management committee is company-wide and multidisciplinary, comprising representatives from both the management and working level, cutting across all corporate and operational units that are material to the business. The committee is responsible for implementing, monitoring, and reporting various aspects of CDL sustainability practices and performance. So having this comprehensive approach at the management level ensures that CDL is taking a holistic approach to climate-related issues. The second TCFD pillar is the strategy pillar. Once the company has a vision and governance structure around climate-related issues, the next natural step is to integrate it into their business strategy. Again, I'm sharing on this slide a typical trajectory that we see as companies develop in this area. At first, companies may not be considering climate-related issues in their organization at all, but once these issues are implemented at the governance level, it should naturally start influencing business strategy. And the first step to do is to conduct assessments to see how climate-related risks and opportunities may affect your long-term business strategy. With ever stronger climate change, increasing regulations and stakeholder expectations, companies are doing more and more to put their organization on a trajectory that aligns with domestic and international expectations. And as Joe talked about, the relatively new tool to help with this is scenario analysis, which is a forward-looking tool, which we will go more in detail in a later workshop. And then also on the more advanced level, we see companies taking the findings from these types of assessments and adjusting the course of their long-term business strategy accordingly. This may have, in some cases, short-term headaches, but the long-term benefits of adjusting your strategy to align with a changing world will increase the likelihood of your business not only surviving, but thriving in the global transition to a low-carbon economy. To understand how a company is implementing climate issues into their strategy, the TCFD has 3 recommended disclosures that Joe mentioned about how climate risks have impacted their organization over various time horizons, as well as how they have impacted the company's operational and financial planning. Again, here CDP breaks the TCFD guidelines into multiple questions. Some of them are shown on the right-hand side. So we ask companies to provide details of any climate-related risks and opportunities that they have identified with as much granularity and detail as possible. For example, we ask for type of impact, whether it's a transitional risk from a changing regulatory environment or a physical risk from more extreme weather events and so forth. We are also asking questions about the potential financial impacts of these risks and opportunities. And what are the relevant time horizons, the likely impact, and so forth. And to understand how companies are addressing these risks, we also ask for detailed information about what the company is doing to adjust its operational and financial planning accordingly. Also, what type of forward-looking mechanisms are in place to ensure that the company is resilient against increasingly severe impacts. And as with the first pillar, the TCFD recommended disclosures under strategy may seem like very basic questions at the face value, but by following the CDP questionnaire and exercise, you can build a comprehensive and detailed response that is useful for data users to understand and get a clear picture of how your organization is approaching and addressing these issues at the strategic level. Next, we move on to risk management, which is closely related to what we discussed under strategy. So evaluating exposure to climate-related risks and opportunities over a range of time horizon is essential for developing a strategy for the global transition to a low-carbon economy recognized in the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, here, the first step towards best practice is to have processes in place to be able to identify and assess climate-related risks. Most, if not all, companies on the call today are likely to have some type of enterprise risk management system or ERM in place to assess and manage various types of material risks. When companies first started assessing climate risk, we often saw them doing so by developing a standalone risk assessment process for evaluating these types of risks. Now, we usually see climate risk assessment being fully integrated into company-wide risk assessment. And this is also what CDP considers best practice. And we look forward to deep diving into this in our next workshop. So to further improve your climate risk assessment, the next step is to do assessments that are robust enough to not only identify the risk, but also assess individual climate risk in a financially quantitative manner. This will allow your organization to fully understand the potential impacts of individual risk, as well as help you prioritize your response to each risk. And setting a dollar amount on a potential risk is often difficult, but you can also consider approaches such as defining a range with a lower and higher boundary. And again, you can see the TCFD recommended disclosure for risk management on the left-hand side. CDP here, we ask for a further breakdown of the risks that we already talked about under the strategy pillar. The aim is to better understand the processes the company has in place to identify, assess, and importantly, respond to climate-related risks and opportunities. And again, here we are looking at details such as frequency of assessment, the scopes, the types of risks, and so forth. And yeah, and also, as I mentioned in this previous slide, we also ask for financial information, such as, are you able to estimate a potential financial impact of these risks? So all in all, this information can help investors to assess the potential impact to valuations and the adequacy of the company's risk response. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump over this slide. I'm realizing that I'm running a bit late. So finally, we come to the fourth and final pillar, which is metrics and targets. Target setting provides direction and structure to environmental strategy, providing information on quantitative targets and qualitative goals, and progress made against these targets can demonstrate your organization's commitment to improving climate-related issues at the corporate level. This information is relevant to investors because it helps them understand how your company is addressing and monitoring progress regarding the risks and opportunities disclosed in the previous sections that we just discussed. So we have questions on emissions reduction initiative that also allows data users to understand the organization's commitment to reducing emissions beyond a business as usual scenario. So under metrics and targets, CDP first look at the emissions profile reported by companies. So whether the company is able to report on their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which is direct and indirect emissions. The next step we look at is whether the data is verified by third-party auditors. Verification ensures reliable, credible, and quality assured information. And next, we get to the environmental leaders who are taking actions to reduce their emissions by having environmental initiatives and emissions reduction targets in place. The best practice, again, when it comes to reduction targets, are what we call science-based targets. These are targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in alignment with the goal of the Paris Agreement. And as mentioned on the previous slide, to align with these recommendations, we recommend companies to disclose scope 1 and 2 emissions. We also encourage companies to disclose scope 3 emissions where relevant, which are indirect emissions from your value chain. We then also ask about absolute emissions targets, intensity targets, net zero targets, and other types of reduction initiatives. For example, questions on low carbon products provide valuable information to investors who are seeking to increase their investment in companies providing low carbon and climate resilient goods and services. I will just go through this quickly, but to give you an example of the best practice, which we consider to be science-based emissions reduction targets, I'm going to go through this quickly. But if you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend looking into the Science-Based Targets Initiative, This is an initiative co-founded by CDP, which helps companies establish and validate science-based emissions reduction targets. As I mentioned, and as Pratima mentioned earlier, these are targets that are ambitious enough to align with the goals of the Paris Agreement of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius as compared to pre-industrial levels. As climate action has not been sufficiently ambitious, companies now are required to set targets that are aligned with the 1.5 degree trajectory to meet what CDP considers best practice. And you can see an example of a Thai company, Fortune Parts Industry Public Company Limited, who have a validated science-based targets. This is the first company in Thailand to set such a target through the Science-Based Targets Initiative in Thailand. And they join 708 other companies worldwide who has done the same. So that's an introduction to how you can use CDP's questionnaire and framework as a tool to start collecting and reporting data in alignment with the TCFD recommendations. And again, today is just an introduction, and we will go more in depth in the next workshops. And that's it from me. In the following part, I will hand it over to my colleague Elim, who will share more information about the practical steps that you can take and which other supporting resources you can use to get started on your own roadmap for TCFD aligned reporting. So Elim, over to you.
Thank you, Fred. Hi everyone, my name is Elim. This is my pleasure to be here today. So this part is very quickly, I just want to show you where you can find online resources that I've developed to help companies make better quality environmental reporting and align with the TCFD recommendations. So to start with, we have this checklist here, which shows 10 practical steps that you can take to start disclosing to CDP and integrating the TCFD recommendations into standard business processes. I won't go into detail, but we have 10-point checklists here, which covers everything. For example, the first 2 points are about mainstreaming climate-related risk and opportunity through internal cooperation and integration. The third point is related to making the most of your company risk management processes. Next, using existing quality assurance and compliance approaches for identifying and evaluating climate risks and financial impacts. Number 5, using existing tools such as the CDP questionnaire to collect data. 6, suggestion on linking climate and financial information. And 7, engage investors for feedback. 8, reporting as if your report is going to be assured. And the next one relates to using at least 2 scenarios. And finally, using your mainstream report as a vehicle for disclosure. And to help you prepare for this TCFD disclosure, you may look through the checklist from the previous slide and think about how your organization could apply these steps internally. And through this process, you'll be able to identify what potential barriers your organization may face. Then you can prioritize actions and allocate resources to overcome these barriers along your reporting journey. So the checklist was an excellent tool to help you to quickly examine your readiness, whereas the TCFD official website holds lots of detailed guidance explaining specific areas of TCFD disclosures. Next, please. So another resources I would like to share is a TCFD Knowledge Hub. So this is an e-learning platform developed together by the CDSB Climate Disclosure Standard Board and the TCFD. And the Knowledge Hub provides the latest tools, resources, case studies, and insights to help our companies to learn about disclosing climate-related information. And you can see it as a database containing all kinds of TCFD-related materials. Next, please. Yes. So from the Knowledge Hub, you can also enroll free courses that are designed to fill companies' knowledge gap and enhance your climate-related disclosure. And the content of these courses were developed for all audience. So from those who are new to climate reporting to those who want to build on the existing skill sets. So while the information provided in the CDP response cover much of the same ground as the TCFD recommendations, it is best practice for these material climate-related financial disclosures to be included in the financial annual report to meet the expectation of the TCFD. So CDSB and CDP came together to create this new guide called Building Blocks, and the report includes step-by-step guidance explaining how you can take your information from your CDP disclosures and report in your mainstream report. We do this by highlighting the most relevant CDP climate questions and explains how this information can best used for reporting in the mainstream report using CDSB reporting principles. We have these materials available in English, but we'll be translating some of these guidance from English to Thai in the coming months. So we'll be sharing them with you once they're ready, and please stay tuned to that. Next slide is just, this will be my last slide. As Fred explained, CDP's questionnaire is designed to be fully aligned with TCFD. So you can find the full questionnaires from the links on this page. Besides, we also have question by question guidance document and scoring methodology available to all. And if you wish to familiarize yourself with CDP disclosures, I encourage you to look at our reporting guides after this session, where we also indicate which questions are connected to frameworks such as the SDG and DJSI. Of course, you're also more than welcome to reach out to us if you would like to know more about how to start disclosing through CDP. That's it from me. I will pass the time to Fred.
Thank you very much, Alim. And as our final speaker for the day, we are very happy to be joined by an experienced company who can share direct insights into how corporate environmental management and reporting can be approached in practical terms. To do so, we are pleased to be joined by Dr. Nattikorn from PTT Global Chemical. PTT Global Chemical is among the 48 companies from Thailand who disclosed environmental data through CDP's questionnaire in 2020, and they are the first and only company in the country to make it to our A list for this reporting. So among thousands of companies globally, only about 2% made it to CDP's A list for our TCFD aligned questionnaire. So this is no easy task. So we are therefore very pleased to be joined by Dr. Nattikorn to share more information about their own experience. So thank you very much, Dr. Nattikorn, for joining us. And I will share the slides. Let me see here.
Yep, I can see it. So you can hear me well, right?
Yeah, I can hear you well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introductions. Let me try to switch to the Thai version for better explanation and understandings. ขอบคุณนะครับก็ณัฐกรนะครับเป็นตัวแทนจาก PTT Global Chemical นะครับวันนี้ก็คงมาแชร์ตัว practice เกี่ยวกับตัว climate action นะครับว่าที่มาที่ไปของบริษัทเรามอง activity ด้านนี้ยังไงแล้วก็เรามีการพิจารณาอย่างไรนะครับจนกระทั่งเป็น action ที่เรามีการดำเนินงานอยู่ทุกวันนี้นะครับ Can we move to the next slide ครับก็ก่อนอื่นนะครับขอintroduce ตัว PTT Global Chemical นิดนึงนะครับจริงๆแล้วเนี่ยตัว PTT Global Chemical หรือ GC ครับเราเป็น flagship ทางด้าน petrochemical นะครับของกลุ่มปตท.นะครับโดยที่ธุรกิจหลักๆของเราเนี่ยครับมีอยู่8ธุรกิจใหญ่นะครับเริ่มต้นตั้งแต่ตัว upstream ที่เป็น refinery aromatics olefin นะครับไปจนกระทั่งถึงตัวผลิตภัณฑ์ที่เป็น downstream นะครับเป็น polymers นะครับรวมไปถึง chemicals ต่างๆนะครับรวมถึงตัวที่เป็น green chemicals ด้วยนะครับปัจจุบันเองเนี่ยเรามีกำลังการผลิตนะครับประมาณ11ล้านตันต่อปีนะครับแล้วก็มีการขาย product เราไปทั่วโลกนะครับมีทั้งฐานกำลังการผลิตในเมืองไทยแล้วก็ตัวที่เป็น international นะครับ Can we move to the next slide to next slide please yes คราวนี้นะครับเพื่อการเติบโตของธุรกิจของเราครับวันนี้ตัว strategy ของบริษัทเองเนี่ยเราเรียกว่าเป็น3 steps นะครับสำหรับการโตของธุรกิจในอนาคตนะครับโดยที่อันแรกนะครับquickly recap ก็คือเรื่องของ step change นะครับจะเป็น activity ที่เราจะไปทำกับตัวกลุ่มธุรกิจที่มีอยู่ในปัจจุบันนะครับให้มันเข้มแข็งขึ้นนะครับ step out เป็นเรื่องของการพยายามจะไปดู growth opportunity ใน area ต่างๆนะครับแล้วก็ step up นะครับจะเป็นเรื่องของการนำเอาตัว sustainability เนี่ยเข้ามาผนวกเข้าเป็นพาร์ทหนึ่งของการดำเนินธุรกิจนะครับเพื่อที่จะทำให้เราสามารถเติบโตได้อย่างยั่งยืนนะครับแล้วก็จะเห็นว่าตัว climate นะครับตัว circular economy หรือตัว waters เองเนี่ยก็เป็นหนึ่งในประเด็นสำคัญสำหรับเรื่อง step up นี้นะครับที่เราพยายามหา strategy ที่จะมา integrate เข้าไปกับ business นะครับขอnext slide please ครับคราวนี้ถ้าถามว่าทำไม GC เรามองว่าเรื่อง climate นะครับเป็นประเด็นสำคัญเนี่ยต้องบอกว่าจริงๆแล้วถ้าไปจับตาดูตัว external factor ต่างๆที่เกิดขึ้นวันนี้นะครับเราจะเห็นว่ามันมี evolution ที่เริ่มต้นมาตั้งแต่อดีตแล้วนะครับเพียงแต่ปัจจุบันเนี่ยมันเริ่มมีความเข้มข้นขึ้นนะครับอย่างเช่นตัวซ้ายมือบนนะครับตัว global protocol ต่างๆเองเนี่ยเราจะเห็นว่าเรื่อง climate เองจริงๆไม่ใช่เป็นเรื่องใหม่สำหรับโลกนี้นะครับมันมีการคุยกันมาตั้งแต่1960นะครับเพียงแต่ว่าลักษณะในการพูดคุยหรือลักษณะของโปรโตคอลเนี่ยมันจะมีลักษณะที่แตกต่างกันไปนะครับโดยในช่วงแรกเนี่ยเราคงเห็นว่ามันเป็นการทำเรื่อง climate เพื่อที่จะบอกว่าเราเป็นคนดีนะครับมีอีฟิกในการดำเนินธุรกิจนะครับมีอะไรบ้างที่เราเลือกที่จะไม่ทำอะไรเงี้ยนะครับแต่ว่าปัจจุบันนะครับเราจะเห็นว่าเนื่องจากตัว global event ต่างๆที่มันเกิดขึ้นชัดเจนขึ้นนะครับรวมถึงตัว Paris Agreement หรือ TCFD เองที่มีความชัดเจนมากขึ้นเนี่ยจะเห็นว่าคนให้ความสำคัญในเรื่องของ climate นะครับไม่ได้เป็นเรื่องของการเป็น good governance นะครับไม่ได้เรื่องของการเป็นคนดีแล้วแต่ว่าไปมองในเรื่องของการทำ climate นะครับเพื่อที่จะทำให้เกิด positive impact กับบริษัทนะครับเพื่อที่จะ maintain ตัว competitiveness ไว้นะครับคราวนี้ถ้ามาดูข้างล่างก็จะเห็นว่าทั้งในระดับประเทศต่างๆทั่วโลกนะครับหรือแม้กระทั่งถ้าดูลึกลงไปเป็นระดับบริษัทเนี่ยทุกคนก็เริ่มมีแอคชั่นกับสิ่งเหล่านี้มากขึ้นนะครับโดยที่ปัจจุบันเนี่ยเห็นว่ากว่า 50% ของตัว Greenhouse เนี่ยมีการ pledge ว่าจะทำreduction นะครับในปีต่างๆกันนะครับพอเราดูปัจจัยต่างๆแบบนี้นะครับบริษัทเราก็เลยมองว่าจริงๆแล้วเนี่ยโมเมนตัมเกี่ยวกับตัว climate เนี่ยมันมีความชัดเจนมากขึ้นเรื่อยๆนะครับแล้วมันไม่ใช่เป็นเรื่องของการทำเพื่อที่จะเป็นคนดีแล้วแต่จริงๆแล้วเนี่ยมันเป็นบริบทที่เกี่ยวกับ competitiveness หรือความสามารถในการแข่งขันในระยะกลางถึงระยะยาวของบริษัทนะครับทำยังไงที่เราจะสามารถเอา climate มาเป็นส่วนหนึ่งเพื่อที่จะ protect value ของธุรกิจปัจจุบันที่เราดำเนินการอยู่ได้นะครับหรือแม้กระทั่งไปพยายาม create ตัว opportunity ใหม่ๆที่เราจะสามารถ capture ได้นะครับมันก็เลยเป็นที่มาของการพยายามยกระดับเรื่องของ climate ขึ้นนะครับของ GC เราครับ next slide please ครับคราวนี้พอตอนที่เราเห็นแล้วว่า climate เองเนี่ยเป็นสิ่งที่เกี่ยวข้องกับตัว competitiveness ในอนาคตนะครับสิ่งที่เราพยายามจะทำก็คือเราพยายามแบ่งเป็น3สเต็ปหลักๆนะครับอย่างแรกก็คือเราจะต้องเซตอัพโทนของ corporate ก่อนนะครับให้ทุกคนเข้าใจความหมายเดียวกันนะครับให้เข้าใจ intention เดียวกันของการดำเนินงานด้าน climate ว่ามันเป็นเรื่องเกี่ยวกับความสามารถในการแข่งขันในอนาคตมันเป็นเรื่องใกล้ตัวมากขึ้นนะครับหลังจากนั้นเนี่ยก็เริ่มมีการ implement concept นะครับไปตาม business unit หรือแม้กระทั่งในเรื่องของ portfolio ต่างๆนะครับมีการ set governance ที่ให้ชัดเจนขึ้นนะครับเพื่อเราบริหารจัดการเรื่องของ climate ได้อย่างครบถ้วนมากขึ้นนะครับแล้วก็สุดท้ายเองเนี่ยพอมีการนำไป implement นะครับก็ต้องมีการติดตามนะครับว่าผลที่ได้เป็นอย่างไรนะครับมีการ disclose นะครับมี third party verification เพื่อที่จะเอาตัวนี้กลับมาเป็น input ว่าแล้วโทนของ corporate เองเนี่ยมันควรจะมีความเข้มข้นมากขึ้นมากน้อยเพียงใดนะครับและอีกอย่างหนึ่งที่จะไฮไลท์ก็คือว่าพอเรามีการเซต3 pillar เสร็จปุ๊บนะครับเราก็มีการคุยกันว่าเรื่องของ climate ทั้ง3 สเต็ปนะครับมันก็คงเป็นเรื่องของตัวboard level กับ senior level accountability มากขึ้นนะครับคราวนี้ถ้าเรามาเจาะดูในแต่ละสเต็ปนะครับเริ่มจาก set up the tones นะครับเราก็มีการ set up team นะครับเพื่อที่จะ monitor แล้วก็ดูนะครับว่าเรื่องของ climate เองเนี่ยมีผลหรือใกล้ตัวกับบริษัทเรายังไงนะครับโดยที่เราก็มีการคอยดูว่าสิ่งต่างๆที่เข้ามากระทบกับธุรกิจวันนี้เนี่ยนะครับตั้งแต่อดีตจนถึงปัจจุบันเนี่ยมันมีเวฟอะไรบ้างที่เข้ามาชนนะครับแล้วก็มีการพูดคุยกันใน top management นะครับเพื่อที่จะมีagree กันว่าจริงๆแล้วคำว่า sustainability นะครับซึ่งรวมถึง climate circularity แล้วก็อื่นๆเนี่ยมันเป็นสิ่งที่ปัจจุบันเนี่ยเริ่มเข้ามากระทบ ตัว business เรามากขึ้นแล้วนะครับสิ่งที่มากระทบก่อนอันนี้มันอาจจะเป็นในเชิงของ short term competitiveness ที่จับต้องได้นะครับเพราะมันเป็นเรื่องของราคาเรื่องของตัวความสามารถในการแข่งขันเองนะครับแต่ climate เองเนี่ยมันเป็นเหมือน long term competitiveness ที่เราจะต้องไปตี impact ของมันให้ชัดเจนได้มากขึ้นเพื่อที่จะวางแผนในระยะยาวนะครับโดยที่ง่ายๆนะครับสรุปขวามือที่เป็นสีแดงกับสีน้ำเงินนะครับก็เป็นสิ่งที่เราพยายามจะสรุปและหารือกันว่าเรื่องของ sustainability เรื่องของ climate เองเนี่ยถ้าไม่มีการบริหารจัดการที่ดีนะครับมันจะมามีผลกระทบในเชิงของ competitiveness นะครับยกตัวอย่างเช่นในเรื่องของต้นทุนต่างๆที่จะเกิดจาก taxation scheme ที่จะมีเกิดขึ้นนะครับเรื่องของ financing cost ที่อาจจะมีการปรับไปจากนโยบายของสถาบันการเงินนะครับรวมถึงเรื่องของ demand นะครับที่อาจจะมีการเปลี่ยนแปลงไปจากนโยบายของประเทศต่างๆนะครับในขณะที่มันก็เป็น opportunity เหมือนกันนะครับสำหรับบริษัทต่างๆที่จะไปดูว่าด้วยการ transition เหล่านี้เองเนี่ยมันมี growth area ใหม่ๆเกิดขึ้นไหมนะครับมีโอกาสที่บริษัทจะเข้าถึง financing ในรูปแบบต่างๆที่สามารถให้ประโยชน์กับบริษัทได้มากขึ้นไหมนะครับและสุดท้ายก็คือเป็นเรื่องของ reputation นะครับเพราะฉะนั้นเนี่ยพอเรามีการวิเคราะห์อย่างนี้ปุ๊บนะครับในระดับ top management ก็เลยมีการลงความเห็นกันว่าเรื่อง sustainability คงเป็นเป็นเวฟที่เข้ามากระทบกับธุรกิจเราอย่างแน่นอนนะครับแล้วก็คงมีผลในเรื่องของ competitiveness ในระยะยาวแน่นอนแล้วเราคงจะต้องมีการวางแผนรองรับทั้งในเรื่องของทำยังไงให้เราสามารถ protect value ของ existing business ไว้ได้แล้วก็ capture new opportunity ใหม่ๆที่จะเกิดขึ้นในอนาคตได้นะครับ next slide please มันก็เลยเป็นที่มานะครับตอนที่บริษัทนะครับมามองเรื่องของกระบวนการจัดการธุรกิจนะครับวางแผนธุรกิจเราก็เลยมีการมองว่าปกติเวลาเราทำแผนธุรกิจทั่วไปครับเราก็จะเป็นสีน้ำเงินนะครับก็คือมีการวางซีนาริโอเบื้องต้นว่าเราคิดว่า demand supply ในอนาคตจะเปลี่ยนไปยังไงเพื่อที่จะมาประเมินตัวเองว่าภายใต้สถานการณ์เหล่านั้นเนี่ยเรายังอยู่ในโพสิชันที่แข่งขันกับคนอื่นได้นะครับแล้วก็จะเอาเป็นข้อมูลที่ไปฟีดต่อสำหรับการทำ portfolio planning ในอนาคตว่าเราจะโตในธุรกิจไหนเพื่อให้ได้ตาม financial target นะครับแต่ว่าพอเรามองว่า climate เข้ามามีผลกระทบมากขึ้นนะครับเราก็เลยมีการทำ track สีเขียวเนี่ยเพิ่มขึ้นด้วยนะครับโดยที่เริ่มต้นจากการพยายามมองว่าแล้วถ้าโลกไม่ได้เป็นไปอย่างที่เราอยู่ทุกวันเนื่องจากว่าทุกคนมองว่า climate มีผลกระทบเรามากขึ้น scenario อะไรบ้างที่มันจะเป็นไปได้สำหรับ transition นี้นะครับหลังจากนั้นเราก็เอา scenario เนี้ยมาตีเป็นตัว risk เกี่ยวกับธุรกิจปัจจุบันที่เราดำเนินการอยู่นะครับโดยที่มองทั้งในส่วนของ physical risk แล้วก็ transition risk ที่จะเกิดขึ้นนะครับแล้วก็เอาความเสี่ยงเหล่านี้เองเนี่ยมาพยายามตีเป็นตัว financial ว่าถ้าสิ่งเหล่านี้เกิดขึ้นจริงถ้า risk เหล่านี้เกิดขึ้นนะครับมันจะมีผลกระทบกับบริษัทของเราได้ยังไงบ้างนะครับโดยที่เราพยายามจัดเป็นกลุ่มใหญ่ๆเพื่อที่จะสื่อสารกันในองค์กรนะครับแบ่งเป็น3 category ก็คือ impact ที่เกิดจากตัวคาร์บอนต่างๆนะครับเช่นเรื่อง taxation เรื่องของตัวภาษีที่จะเกิดขึ้นนะครับเรื่องของ margin ที่จะกระทบจาก spread ระหว่างตัว feedstock กับ product ที่จะเปลี่ยนไปจากความต้องการของสินค้าที่เปลี่ยนไปนะครับแล้วก็เรื่องสุดท้ายก็คือเรื่องของ sales ที่อาจจะ impact นะครับจากตัว transition จากคนที่ใช้ petro base อาจจะอยากจะใช้ product ที่มี low carbon มากขึ้นเราก็พยายามจะไปจับคีย์หลักๆพวกนี้มาตีว่าผลกระทบในเชิงmargin หรือ financial ที่จะเปลี่ยนไปคืออะไรในทำนองเดียวกันเราก็พยายามดูว่าแล้ว transition นี้เองมี opportunity ให้บริษัทสามารถไปโตในธุรกิจอื่นๆได้ไหมนะครับที่ยังสามารถทำให้บริษัทได้ financial target แต่ว่ามีผลกระทบต่อ environmental ที่น้อยลงนะครับตาม transition ที่มันจะเกิดขึ้นนะครับ input ตัวนี้เองเนี่ยเราก็จะใช้เป็นตัวเหมือนภาพของความเสี่ยงนะครับที่จะเอากลับไปกระทบกับการวาง businessแพลนของ business ปัจจุบันของเรานะครับแล้วก็จะไปกระทบกับภาพของ portfolio ในอนาคตว่าลักษณะการเติบโตของเราเองเนี่ยควรจะไปโตที่อยู่ใน area ไหนนะครับแล้วสุดท้ายเนี่ยพอเรามีการนำไปกระทบในเรื่องของ long term portfolio ปุ๊บครับเราก็จะมีการเอาไปกระทบกับวิธีบริหารจัดการ portfolio ต่อว่าแล้วเพื่อที่จะ shape portfolio ของบริษัทไปในทิศทางนั้นนะครับเรื่องของ protocol ภายในควรจะทำอะไรบ้างเช่นเรื่องของ investment protocol นะครับเรื่องของ internal carbon pricingเรื่องของ carbon management ภายในหรือแม้กระทั่งเรื่องของการ manage future growth เนี่ยจะต้องมีตรงไหนบ้างที่เราจะต้องไป อัปเกรดตัวโปรโตคอลเหล่านี้ให้สอดคล้องกับตัวทิศทางของบริษัทนะครับและสุดท้ายก็จะทำให้เราได้ target อีกตัวหนึ่งงอกออกมานะครับไม่ได้มีแต่ financial ก็คือเราจะมี emission target เนี่ยที่จะบริหารจัดการควบคู่ไปด้วยนะครับสุดท้ายก็คือเพื่อที่จะทำให้เราสามารถรักษาตัว competitiveness แล้วก็ value ของบริษัทไว้ได้ในอนาคตนะครับขอหน้าถัดไป Can move to next slide ครับอันนี้นะครับเป็นตัวอย่างนะครับของ risk ที่เราดูนะครับหลักการที่เราดูเบื้องต้นก็คือเราพยายามดูก่อนว่า base case ของเราที่เราทำอยู่วันนี้ครับมันเป็นการดำเนินงานที่มองสอดคล้องกับซีนาริโอไหนนะครับโดยที่เราพยายามไปยึดกับซีนาริโอที่มีมาตรฐานอยู่ไม่ว่าจะเป็น IEA หรือสถาบันต่างๆเนี่ยนะครับเพื่อที่จะดูว่าโดย assumption ของ base case ที่เรา manage ธุรกิจในปัจจุบันเนี้ยวันนี้มันอยู่ประมาณซีนาริโอที่สอดคล้องกับเลเวลไหนนะครับแล้วเราก็พยายามมองไปว่าถ้าโลกไม่ได้มีการดำเนินงานตามนี้แต่โลกปล่อยให้การใช้ fossil fuel เป็นเหมือนเดิมนะครับอุณหภูมิของโลกเพิ่มขึ้นนะครับ physical risk นะครับด้านบนที่จะเกิดขึ้นคืออะไรนะครับหยิบซีนาริโอไหนมาเป็น representative สำหรับการตี impact นะครับในขณะที่เราก็มองอีกแง่หนึ่งว่าแต่ว่าถ้าโลกนี้เนี่ยไม่ได้ยอมให้ธุรกิจดำเนินงานไปแบบ BAU business as usual แบบทุกวันนี้นะครับแต่มี policy ใหม่ๆมา implement นะครับมีการร่วมมือกันมากขึ้นเพื่อที่จะลดโลกร้อนนะครับลดอุณหภูมิเนี่ยตัว transition risk ที่จะเกิดขึ้นมันเป็นอะไรนะครับแล้วเราก็ set up ตัว scenario ของเราขึ้นมาจากการที่ไปดูstandard นี่แหละแล้วก็มาพยายาม adopt บาง factor นะครับให้เข้ากับgeography ที่เรา operate อยู่เข้ากับ local policy ที่มีรวมถึงธุรกิจต่างๆที่เราดำเนินอยู่นะครับเราก็จะมี case ภายในที่เรียกว่าเป็น accelerated energy transition ที่ align กับ 2 degree นะครับแล้วก็เพื่อที่จะทำ case เนี่ยเราก็ยังไปหยิบตัว IEA case นะครับที่เป็น below 2 degree เนี่ยเอามาดูควบคู่ไปด้วยนะครับเพื่อที่จะดู impact เพราะนั้นจริงๆเนี่ยเราจะมีอยู่ประมาณ 2-3 scenario ที่เราพยายามทำนะครับหลังจากนั้นเนี่ยพอเราได้ scenario ที่เราจะทำเสร็จปุ๊บครับเราก็พยายามดูว่าภายใต้ซีนาริโอนั้นเนี่ยมีอะไรบ้างเป็นตัว drive ที่ทำให้เกิดความเสี่ยงครับเช่นในเรื่องของ transition risk นะครับคงจะมี3 factor ที่มา drive นะครับให้มันเกิด transition แล้วมีผลกระทบในเรื่องความเสี่ยงเช่นเรื่องของ policy นะครับเรื่องของ market แล้วก็เรื่องของตัว technology นะครับหลังจากนั้นเราก็พยายามไปตีต่อว่าโดย factor risk factor เหล่านี้อะไรจะเป็น attribute ที่จะเกิดขึ้นแล้วก็สุดท้าย impact ที่มาสู่ businessมันคืออะไรนะครับเช่นในเรื่อง policy นะครับมันคงไป drive ให้เกิดในเรื่องของ carbon mechanism มากขึ้นนะครับสุดท้ายเนี่ยมันคงมามีผลกระทบในเชิงของ taxation ที่บริษัทจะต้องมี obligation ในการที่จะต้องไปจ่ายนะครับมามีผลกระทบต่อ cost ในเชิงของ market เรื่องของ demand ที่เปลี่ยนไปนะครับเรื่องความต้องการของคนอาจจะมากระทบในเชิงของ price ของ product หรือมากระทบในเชิงของ margin ของแต่ละ product ที่เปลี่ยนไปนะครับในเชิงเทคโนโลยีก็อาจจะมามีผลกระทบต่อ capital investment ที่เราจะต้อง monitor หรือลงทุนในอนาคตนะครับรวมถึงเรื่องของการพัฒนาเทคโนโลยีต่างๆที่จะให้มาสอดรับกับตัว transition ที่จะเกิดขึ้นเราก็พยายามตี impact อย่างเงี้ยแล้วก็เอา impact เหล่านี้ครับไปพยายามตีผลกระทบออกมาในเชิงของตัวเงินนะครับสำหรับ transition risk ครับอันนี้เป็น example นะครับ Can you move to next slideครับอันนี้นะครับก็เป็น example ที่เราเอาจากหน้าของ risk นะครับไปตีผลกระทบนะครับซ้ายมือเนี่ยจะเป็นตัวอย่างของ physical risk นะครับขวามือจะเป็นตัวอย่าง transition risk นะครับอย่างเช่น physical risk อย่างเงี้ยครับเราก็จะมีการไปประเมินว่าด้วย area ที่บริษัทเราเนี่ยมีโรงงานอยู่ครับมีโอกาสได้รับผลกระทบอะไรบ้างในเชิง physical risk นะครับตัวอย่างเช่นเรื่องของ water stress ที่อาจจะเกิดขึ้นนะครับเราก็พบว่าจากการประเมินอันนี้ครับบริษัทเรานะครับอยู่ในโซนที่เป็นกึ่งสีส้มก็คือมีความเสี่ยงกลางๆจนถึงสูงเนี่ยครับมันก็จะเป็น input หนึ่งที่เราเอาไปใช้ในการวางตัว water strategy สำหรับบริษัทเรานะครับไม่ว่าจะเป็นเรื่องของภายในทำยังไงให้เรามีการใช้น้ำได้อย่างมีประสิทธิภาพสูงสุดนะครับมีเทคโนโลยีที่เหมาะสมเพื่อเพิ่ม resilience in case ว่ากรณีน้ำแล้งเกิดขึ้นเราจะยังสามารถหาน้ำในจากซอสอื่นมาซัพพลายได้นะครับเช่นมาจาก sea water RO หรืออื่นๆอะไรเงี้ยครับรวมถึงการไปดำเนินงานร่วมกับภายนอกนะครับทำยังไงให้ผลกระทบกับ community เนี่ยไม่ได้มีมากจากการดำเนินงานของเรานะครับรวมถึงเรื่องของการหาซอสต่างๆที่จะมาซัพพลายในกรณีที่ตัว water state เกิดขึ้นนะครับอันนี้ก็เป็นตัวอย่างของการที่เราไปดู physical risk นะครับแล้วก็เป็นเอามาใช้เป็นหนึ่งใน input นะครับของการวาง strategy ภายในนะครับ ฝั่งขวามือเนี่ยจะเป็น transition risk นะครับเราก็จะมีการดูว่าถ้า carbon cost เกิดขึ้นถ้า demand เปลี่ยนไปหรือความต้องการของคนเปลี่ยนไปอย่างเงี้ยครับในแต่ละปีมันอาจจะมีผลกระทบต่อ bottom line business ยังไงนะครับเช่นถ้าไม่ทำอะไรเลยใน medium term อาจจะมีผลกระทบประมาณ 30% แต่ว่าใน long term เนี่ยมีโอกาสได้รับผลกระทบถึง 90% นะครับหลักๆมาจากเรื่องของความต้องการของผลิตภัณฑ์ที่มันเปลี่ยนไปอะไรอย่างเงี้ยครับซึ่งจาก study นี้เองเนี่ยมันก็ไปเป็น input ทั้งในเชิงของ business plan นะครับที่คงต้องไปดูว่าทำยังไงที่จะทำให้ competitiveness ของเราอยู่ในเลเวลที่โอเคทำยังไงที่เราจะสามารถผลิต product ที่ mark up margin หรือ price ได้มากกว่า typical market price นะครับเพื่อทำให้ปัจจัยความเสี่ยงเหล่านี้ลดลงในระยะกลางถึงระยะยาวนะครับในขณะที่ตัว portfolio ภาพรวมของเราเองเนี่ยเราก็คงมองต่อว่าถ้าโอกาสหรือถ้า risk ที่เรา expose เนี่ยมีมากขึ้นเราจะบริหารจัดการกับตัว portfolio ของธุรกิจนี้ยังไงอะไรเงี้ยครับในอนาคตเราจะไปเติบโตในกลุ่มธุรกิจอื่นหรือเราจะยังคงคีปธุรกิจนี้ไว้นะครับเพื่อที่จะทำให้เราสามารถได้เป้าหมายทั้งในเชิงของ financial แล้วก็ในเชิงของคาร์บอนนะครับแล้วก็อย่างที่แจ้งถัดมาคือพอเรามีการคุยแบบนี้ปุ๊บมันก็จะดิวดาวมาถึงตัวmechanism ต่างๆในการ manage ภายในบริษัททั้งในเรื่องของ investment ทั้งในเรื่องต่างๆนะครับcan we move to next slide next slide please yes อันนี้นะครับเป็นตัวอย่างของผลที่เราได้จากปีนี้คือหลังจากที่เรามารีวิสิตตัวความเสี่ยงทั้งหมดนะครับโดยเฉพาะ transition risk นะครับเราก็จะเห็นว่าโดยสิ่งที่ GC เคยมี commitment ไว้ก่อนหน้านี้หรือเราทำครับเรื่องของตัว greenhouse gas reduction ไม่ว่าจะเป็น 20% reduction 52% reduction อย่างเงี้ยครับวันนี้โดยมองไปข้างหน้าโดยสถานการณ์ด้วย scenario ที่เรามองเนี่ยมันอาจจะยังไม่เพียงพอที่จะทำให้เรายังสามารถรักษาตัว competitiveness level ของเรานะครับแล้วก็ยังเติบโตได้อย่าง sustainable อะไรอย่างเงี้ยครับเราก็เลยมีการพิจารณาเพื่อที่จะ strengthen ตัว action ของเราเพิ่มเติมนะครับให้สอดคล้องกับตัว global context นะครับให้สอดคล้องกับ Paris Agreement โดยที่ยังคงมองเรื่องของ competitiveness และ growth ควบคู่กันไปนะครับก็เลยเป็นสาเหตุที่ปีนี้เรามีความพยายามในการที่อยากจะเซตตัว net zero target นะครับแต่ว่าเดี๋ยวคงจะมี formal announcement ออกมาว่าจะเป็นปีไหนแล้วเราจะทำอย่างไรนะครับแต่ว่าจาก study เบื้องต้นเนี่ยก็เลยทำให้เราคิดว่าตัวนี้เราคงต้องทำให้มันเข้มข้นขึ้นแล้วก็คงจะต้องมีดีเทลอย่างชัดเจนว่าเพื่อจะไปถึงเป้าหมายเนี้ยactivity ที่เราจะทำเนี่ยมันควรจะเป็นอะไรบ้างแล้วควรจะทำแต่ละอย่างเนี่ยเมื่อไหร่นะครับ Can we move to next slide ครับอันนี้เป็นหน้าสุดท้ายนะครับก็อย่างที่แจ้งก็คือว่าหลังจากที่เราเริ่ม implement ปุ๊บสิ่งที่ต้องทำต่อไปคือเราต้องมีการ monitor กับ measure results นะครับวันนี้เองเราก็พยายามจัดกลุ่มนะครับของ activity ของเราเป็น3กลุ่มใหญ่ๆนะครับเรื่องของการปรับปรุง efficiency เรื่องของการปรับปรุง portfolio แล้วก็เรื่องของ compensation ว่า activity ที่เราทำไปแล้ววันนี้อย่างเงี้ยครับมันสอดคล้องกับเป้าหมายที่เราวางไว้ไหมนะครับมีอะไรบ้างที่เราจะต้องทำให้แข็งแรงมากขึ้นนะครับเพื่อที่จะไปเป็น input ให้กับ top management ตอนที่เรา set up the tone of corporate นะครับว่ามองไปข้างหน้าเองเนี่ย area ไหนที่เราจะมีการบริหารจัดการให้เข้มข้นมากขึ้นนะครับอันนี้น่าจะเป็นทั้งหมดที่เอามาแชร์ครับ Yep, I think this would be all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nathakorn. Yeah, it's really interesting to see all the work that you're doing, and it's great to have all these examples. So that's really good to see. If you don't mind, we have received one question in for you before we go to our Q&A session. So one of the participants is asking, how often do you recommend companies to disclose on environmental data? So is this a monthly or biannually or an annual process? What is the reporting frequency that you would recommend?
I think at least annually the corporate should disclose the performance in terms of the greenhouse gas and the inventories, because this is going to be very important information to show to the investor and publics on what will be the progress of your corporate in terms of the strategy and action around the climate. Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Nathakorn, and thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate it. So I'm going to go back to my slide again. Let's see here if I can find that. So hopefully you can see my PowerPoint again, is it? Yeah, great. And then, so we still have some time for Q&A. We have a lot of good questions coming in the second half as well. But before we get to the Q&A, I just want to quickly share with you, as we've mentioned throughout the webinar, that this today is the first in a series of workshops that we will be delivering in 2021. So building on the TCFD recommendations and the sustainable development goals. On the slide, you can see the timeline for our upcoming workshops. Tomorrow, our partners from GRI will host a workshop to share information about how companies can integrate the sustainable development goals into their business strategy. Later in June, you can see the dates on the screen there. We will also build on this week's workshops to deep dive into some of the TCFD recommendations. And as Dr. Nathakorn already showed some examples about, we will focus on climate-related scenario analysis and climate risk assessments and give you some practical examples of the tools and the methods that companies use to do that. So we will share the invitation to the next round of workshops shortly. So please save the date for this. And then finally, before the Q&A, to help us improve our upcoming workshops, we would really appreciate if you can take 5 minutes to complete a short feedback survey to provide feedback on this session. So this will help us to fine-tune and develop the next round of workshops. So please follow the link on the screen or the QR code. We will also put the link in the chat. And then again, this is very important for us. So we would really appreciate if you can take just a few minutes to complete this. And in case you received this slide before the event, please note that we had to update the link because the first one stopped working. So please use the link that you can see on the screen to complete it. So that's it. We have 8 minutes left for Q&A. We will also share the questions and the answers after the event. We have received a lot of really good questions. So Joe, I will address the first one to you, please. So yeah, one is, how often do I need to report on TCFD recommended disclosure, which Dr. Nathakorn touched on? And should all recommended disclosures be within the same report, which we also briefly talked about before the break?
Sure, that's a great question. So the TCFD, sorry about that. That's a great question. The TCFD recommends that the recommendations should be published in your annual mainstream financial, your annual reporting. So that would be your mainstream financial reporting, and the recommended disclosures should also be contained within a single report. As Fred mentioned, another great venue to publish this information is through CDP's platform. We capture that data in our own climate change questionnaire, and submitting it through there is a great way to make sure that it ends up in the hands of investors and other stakeholders. So yeah, that's what we recommend. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I'll address one more to you while I have you here, Joe. So it's, if we don't receive a request from investors this year, do we still need to complete the questionnaire, and why?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the short answer is no, you don't need to. So if you haven't received a CDP request, either through our investor signatories or through our supply chain program, which allows companies to engage with their suppliers through the CDP platform, then you do not have to respond. Having said that, we do allow companies to respond on a self-selected basis. And for all the reasons that Fred talked about, doing that can be a really good way to prepare yourself for fulsome TCFD disclosure, and again, make sure that the information that you're providing is reaching the right stakeholders in in a format that is globally recognized. So we certainly do welcome companies to self-select to respond. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Joe. I think I still have your audio on my side. Okay, great. Wait, you're still unmuted. There, thank you very much, Joe. One more question we have here, Elim, I'll address this one to you. How to implement a TCFD report for a renewable energy company. So it's a renewable energy company. So because they realize the value of their TCFD report, but they emit lower greenhouse gas emissions. So how can a renewable energy company approach TCFD reporting?
Yeah, thanks, Fred. Thanks for the question. So TCFD reporting is not only to capture climate-related risk. It's also very important for companies to report if they can identify any climate-related opportunities. So reporting aligned to TCFD is also a good opportunity for companies like yourself in the renewable energy to able share with investors, other stakeholders about your low carbon products and services. And also this way, it helps investors to understand what are the latest technologies that are available in the market, and also can help attract investments for companies like you. So these opportunities will help other companies in the private sector to transfer to a low carbon economy. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Elim. And also, on a similar note to that, we have one question here that there is a lot of TCFD related recommendations, and how do I get started if I haven't disclosed before? And it's a great question, and that's also another way, similar to also for the renewable energy company. Even if you are a low emitting company, there is still many other areas that you can report on that is very relevant for investors and for other data users. So this is, for example, relating to your governance, as we have talked about. You have structures in place internally to make sure that you are watching out for climate-related issues. And then the second one, also on the strategy level, the second TCFD pillar, what are the strategies that the companies have in place to align with environmental issues? So these are areas that, even for low emitting companies, they are really important to communicate. And also for companies who are starting from the first time, these are usually the low-hanging fruits, because they allow you to really go in and find out where you can most effectively take the first step of incorporating climate issues into your business. And also one important note is that many companies are already doing things relating to environmental management. But in many cases, it's just that it's not, it's just part of the normal business practice, but it's not always, recognized as environmental management. But it's also useful to do an assessment of what are you already doing internally that you can, instead of starting from scratch, but you can update to also incorporate environmental issues. And also just to mention, that as I talked about in the CDP part as well, if you don't know what type of information you should collect, or what are the types of actions that we expect companies to see, then you can go to the CDP website also, and you can download the questionnaire. It's publicly available, and you can look at the questionnaire to see which areas are we already doing something in, and which areas are we not. And that can help you to make a roadmap and a strategy on how to start responding to environmental data. And so I realized that, as we talked about, environmental action and reporting, it's not something that is done overnight. It usually takes, even some years to get to a more, comprehensive level. But the key thing that we always encourage is to take the first step towards doing that. So that was that. I know we are very on time. Pratima, maybe I'll do one final question for you, if you don't mind. Do companies need to estimate the impact on the scenarios they pick, and how strong does the evidence need to do so?
Thanks, Fred. Apologies, I don't have my video on because I have some issues with my video, but just to answer the question, when we are estimating impact, the thing to remember about the TCFD is it relates to financial impact. And so what happens is, number one, you need to consider from a timeline perspective. So if you have a specific scenario, the scenario then has to be considered from the viewpoint of short-term, medium-term, and long-term time frame. So it is quite likely that if you have a scenario picked, that in the short term, you might actually not find an impact, but the question then arises whether this will be a significant impact or not in the medium term or in the long term. And if that is the case, then what can be the possible financial impact of that scenario from a timeline perspective? So while it's quite likely that in the short term, certain scenarios might actually not be impactful or even significant enough, the idea is then to report and justify why you believe this impact is not significant to your business operations.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pratima. And we are 1 minute over time, so we will end it here. For any outstanding questions, we will follow up with you after the event. So again, thank you very much, everyone, for joining the call today. Please remember to complete the survey on the screen, and keep an eye for our invitation to the next workshop. So thanks again to the Stock Exchange of Thailand for working closely with us, to PTT Global Chemical, to the British Embassy, and to every one of you who took time to join us today. We really appreciate it. So thank you, everyone, and have a nice day. Goodbye.